Okay. So thanks to Dragan and David for organizing the conference. What I want to talk about is the film Casablanca, and what I want to suggest is that there's a founding myth of American innocence that is presented to us in that film. And what I mean by that is that the film constitutes a mythical, safe place for white women to continue a legacy of purity that never existed. In other words, I'm suggesting that the marginalization and appropriation of Sam's desire, which is constituted in terms of a symbolic and imaginary value that accrues to white heterosexual male heroic action, allows America to perform a denial of its own racial history. So while America is representing itself as a savior to Europe, it denies its own complicity with slavery. Now, the propagandist subtext of Casablanca has been well documented, and I think it's particularly pertinent to talk about Casablanca in a time when, again, we're at war, although in very different circumstances. My argument then is that there's a certain infantilization of Sam that girds the narrative in a way that has not been fully thought through. And I'm drawing here on an argument made by Robert Gooding Williams, who reads Sam in terms of the trope of fetishism. And what I want to do is build on his analysis, but bring into question the adequacy of the trope of fetishism and suggest that perhaps abjection might be a better way of reading the film, particularly in terms of the notion of the constitutive nature of difference. And this, I think, is where there is some commonality between my paper and the paper that you've just heard. But the way that I want to take the constitutive nature of difference is not so much in terms of the Jew and the Arab, but more in terms of sexuality, race, and class. So in Casablanca, we're represented with a picture of Sam as not yet fully human. The film presents us with a vision of humanity that preserves a mythical white symbolic America from which blacks, women, and homosexuals are either carefully excluded or in which they know they're very precisely circumscribed places. So the question is in a sense, how far does Casablanca depart from the very stereotypical, pernicious representation of race that we find in films like The Birth of a Nation? As Donald Bogle says in The Birth of a Nation, in Griffith's Birth of a Nation, we see things that were kept in order only when whites were in control and when the American Negro was kept in his place. In Casablanca, Sam is transported first to Europe and then back to Africa. In a sense, he's sent back to where he comes from. And thereby, there's a pretense that the problem of race in America is solved. Sam, then, is not allowed to be quite human. He's not represented as a fully desiring subject. He's not permitted to enact his desire or to constitute himself as an I. He is too full of the desires of others. And in a sense, he's a repository of myths. He's a black body that makes music for others. This confirms Robert Gooding Williams' reading that Sam's raison d'etre is to carry the erotic baggage of Rick and Ilse's desire. So despite Rick's earlier claim that Sam is not for sale, Rick has no trouble in transferring Sam to Ferrari once he has decided to send Ilse away with her legal husband. Sam's reluctance to play the song As Time Goes By is not simply to be read as a protective gesture toward Rick, as if it was expressive of a mutual friendship between Rick and Sam. After all, Sam is not Rick's friend and equal. He is an employee, a sidekick, and Rick is his employer and master of the plot. So there's a sense in which the caricature of race that we see presented in films like The Birth of the Nation is not completely repeated in the same way in Birth of the Nation, but as Homi Bhabha has suggested, it is subject to the repetition of a certain stereotype. As Homi Bhabha suggests, what's so powerful about stereotypes is that they're precisely capable of contradiction. And so what we see in Casablanca is perhaps the refiguration of the smiling minstrel figure, in which the ugliness of slavery is conveniently forgotten, and what's occurring, I want to suggest, is a certain repression of racial history. Slavery is never mentioned in the film, but it functions as a past that was never present. If previously African slaves were seen as a happy, compliant, if essentially lazy people, this portrait reemerges in a new guise in the figure of Sam, who smiles, sings, and entertains while remaining in the background of the relationship that is conducted in the foreground. Sam, the muse, also performs the role of spiritual advisor and caretaker of Rick. The danger confronting Europe in World War II was one that was also played out on the grounds of race, in an irony that Hollywood could all too easily sublimate. Remaining, at least on the surface, oblivious to the racial tension Casablanca embodies, critics heralded the film as a departure from the negative stereotypical depictions of race epitomized in earlier films. As Homi Bhabha says, the concept of stereotype as suture is a recognition of the ambivalence of authority and orders of identification. Yet the concept of fetish that drives not just Bhabha's analysis, but also the analysis of Fanon, Cripps, Mulvey, Taylor, and Gooding-Williams needs to be questioned. By turning to the abject rather than the fetish in order to account for the multiple and contradictory beliefs that infuse film narrative, what I think we can avoid is reinscribing another stereotype, one that has proved itself ingeniously adaptable to myriad patriarchal structures, and that is the discourse of phallic monism that I want to suggest even Bhabha's apparently versatile reworking of the fetish ultimately falls prey to. The abject offers a way of looking at the film by focusing on the musical contribution that Sam makes, and I also want to suggest that it's capable of restructuring the self-affirming discourses that tend to solidify around what we see as competing narratives of race and class and sex and heterosexism, but those narratives are in fact always already connected in labyrinthine and mutually supportive ways. That's important because it's all too easy to commit the error of overlooking the profound effects of phallogocentrism and sidestepping the central role of the phallus. And the argument there would go that men lack the phallus just as much as women. What I see is a kind of slippage from the concession that the phallus is operative and the lack that the phallus represents is operative for women too, a slippage from that to the assumption that therefore women are equal with regard to the phallus. In fact, I want to say that there's a sense in which the trope of fetishism, whereby men are apparently driven to continually assure themselves of the phallus that they can ultimately never possess, by enlisting women and various others to perform fetishistic roles, what that does is unproblematically redeploy phallic privilege. So my suggestion to employ the notion of abjection to explore the constitutive nature of difference, the relationship between race, class, and gender, is that it doesn't replay this privilege of phallocentrism. The forces that push some subjects into oppressive positions while other subjects are pushed into oppressed positions remain largely unexamined on the account of fetishism. Subjects do not unconsciously situate themselves in patriarchal, colonial, post-colonial, and class situations in whatever way they want. Rather, these forces are orchestrated by collective fantasies and bodily regimes, by the corporeal schema, which Fanon has shown us those regimes are thoroughly raced. And they require some subjects to occupy zones that are marginal to the point of sometimes being unlivable, dehumanizing, and pathological. That marginality is produced along the lines of predictable fissures, and it takes a real toll. That toll is replete with normative histories, stories we tell ourselves about who is allowed to typically occupy which social and psychic spaces and why. So by focusing on abjection rather than castration anxiety, we can help to reconstitute public discourse about policy and legal issues affecting sexuality and race. The need to refuse gestures which habitually reduce mothers to women, for example, needs to be supplemented by the equally crucial exigency to think through the sense in which racialized figures are asked by white women and men to play subordinate roles. So Sam, as caretaker of Rick's emotions and regulator of his desires, plays in a sort of peculiar skin whose vicissitudes need to be mapped out, not so much the role of coon or buck or sambo, but rather, I want to suggest, of mammy. His effeminization, both as potential erotic carouser and as servant Sam, who carries Rick's and Elsa's erotic baggage, speaks to a kind of maternalization of his role, and yet is also read against the background of servitude and slavery. The narrative of Western imperialism spun out by Casablanca requires the sacrifice of Sam's desire for the reinstallation of Ilsa's passivity as a good white woman. If Ilsa temporarily disrupts this passivity when she pulls a gun with which she threatens Rick, her resolve quickly melts. And when she famously asks Rick to do the thinking for both of them, for all of them, thereby including her lawful husband in her own passive feminization, it's as if she neatly fits herself back into the heterosexist norms that require of women that we not think for ourselves and that we safeguard the alleged purity of an illegitimate national identity. So by allowing herself to be manipulated by Rick, Elsa conserves America both from the threat of miscegenation and from that of homosexuality. The legendary phallic power of black men is thus borrowed by the world-weary and cynical Rick, who must act decisively to save the world. Sam, as both maternal figure and, always ambiguously, phallic figure, can't be read straightforwardly along the lines of sexual differentiation. Yet his maleness is eviscerated by his blackness, and he is ultimately reduced to a powerless maternal figure. Although Rick finally dispenses with Elsa, the outcome advised by Sam, in the process, Sam's reason for existing as protector of Rick evaporates. Sam then becomes the casualty of his own goodwill and selflessness, a dynamic that can't be adequately explained by fetishism, in which Sam creates the surplus value that accrues to his white masters, while at the same time rendering himself superfluous. If we think of the film As Time Goes By as sung by Sam, as something which is a refrain, if you remember the words of the song, it's still the same old story, a kiss is just a kiss. In fact, the homoerotic undertones of the relationship between Sam and Rick that Gooding-Williams points to are just as much supported by the text as an application of that text to Rick and Elsa's relationship. It also, the reworking of the figure of Sam in terms of abjection rather than fetishism allows us to bring in the specific dynamic of race that I want to suggest in a way Gooding-Williams' reading ignores. What he ignores is precisely the mythic phallic power associated with blacks, of which Fanon reminds us. So in a sense, the trope of fetishism works rather differently here. It's not, as it's usually applied to women, that women don't have a penis, but in fact, let's substitute a fetish and pretend that they do have a penis, so that movement of disavowal. But rather, in Sam's case, it's that he does have a penis, but that we're going to act as if he doesn't. Both in the sense, then, that Rick appropriates it for himself, appropriates the penis for himself, thus castrating Sam, and in the sense that as thus castrated, he is effeminized and maternalized. He can look after Rick, but the care that he provides is repudiated. Rick transfers his identification to Renaud at the end of the film, thereby making Elsa into his new transitional object on the way to a homosocial pact. In asking Rick, then, to make the decision for her, Elsa capitulates to her fate, which Rick will determine. Her fate is to safeguard America by returning to her proper wifely role as homemaker. Evading responsibility for her actions, she confirms Freud's belief that women's sense of morality is not very well developed. Yet Elsa's passivity also draws on and reinscribes the boundaries separating black from white, homosexual from heterosexual, and America from Europe. Sam will stay on the edge of North Africa where he belongs. Rick will continue his vagabond outlaw existence, abandoning Sam, while playfully indulging in the possibility of a new homoerotic but still sublimated bond. Meanwhile, white heterosexual Ilse will go to America, embodying, allegedly, all that is good and pure and right. She can therefore represent the mythical essence of white purity that America has produced for itself and set out to preserve in the context of a messy world of which it can wash its hands, having set itself up to heroically intervene and solve Europe's problems and win the war. At the same time as presenting its heroic ideals to the world, America can forget its own genocide of Native Americans, its own history of slavery, and restore itself, with Elsa's help, to its illusory, fictional, powerfully imaginary origins of white innocence. In the Edenic paradise, the mother-child bond is reasserted, but this time its whiteness is guaranteed. So when Rick sends Elsa to Europe with her white, heterosexual, official, anti-Nazi, moral husband, the unlawful contamination of his liaison with Sam is contained in Morocco, on the periphery of Europe, far from America, on the edge of Africa. Robert Ray has explored the ways in which Casablanca takes up and reworks Western gangster themes, particularly in respect of the frontier status Casablanca occupies, and Rick's outlaw hero status, which contrasts with Laszlo as the official hero. Yet, if French Morocco is still a safe zone, and if Casablanca is still a neutral location, a fact on which Laszlo's arrival there depends, its status as a boundary town on the edge of North Africa has not been passed out in terms of Euro-American racial history. Keeping Sam in Africa is a way of making America a safer place, a way of preserving it from the potential conflict that could and will and did rise to the surface if civil rights became contentious. The attempt to contain and diffuse the race problem did not work, but in Casablanca, the myth is formulated, enacted, and preserved. America is kept safe from the playful, licentious, slightly seedy character of Rick, who breaks the rules and whose romantic allure derives in part from his association with Sam. Sam must be kept where he belongs, in Morocco, in its marginal colonial relation to France, the imperialist culture center of Europe. America can thereby protect itself from a threat that is never articulated, the black savage, the quintessential primitive. If Rick returns to America with Ilse, the construction of America's image of itself as pristine, pure, uncontaminated, as white, will be destabilized. The mythical origin of America as a country discovered by Columbus fails to acknowledge the humanity of its Native American residents, just as Laszlo's credentials as a leader of the resistance movement establish him as the appropriate man to return with Ilse to the homeland, without confronting the relevance of his unassailable whiteness. He assures America's mythical future as non-racist, as white, as heterosexual, and as innocent. The apparently Edenic, innocent past represented by the idyllic relationship of Rick and Ilse's Parisian encounter operates as a prehistorical myth whose mythical status is unearthed when Ilse reveals to Rick that all the time, even if she believed her husband to be dead, she was in fact married to Laszlo. Gooding-Williams gestures towards this Edenic mythical past, a fabrication that, albeit illusory, functions as both enabling and alienating. He thereby acknowledges the psychoanalytic genealogy of the notion of fetishism that frames his analysis, although obliquely, since his attribution of the fetish to Marx belies the psychoanalytic background that does not fail to inform his analysis. Indeed, he begins to rewrite his narrative in a way that opens it out to a history that psychoanalysis itself tends to disavow. His evocation of the antebellum genteel relations that supposedly characterize the master-slave relation signals the need to rewrite the founding myths of psychoanalysis in a way that accounts for racial and not only sexual configuration. It is not that overdetermined origin that we call Oedipus. It is not a Greek who casts out his eyes in refusal to look upon what he had done, to whom we must appeal in order to shed light on Casablanca, or rather, in order to allow Casablanca to shed light on our world. Oedipus, who so relentlessly insisted on discovering who he was, and whose knowledge was also a discovery, a self-discovery, constitutes the element in which the myth of mastering the world continues to thrive. In a raced rewriting of Eden, it is not a blinding, castrating self-evisceration that is enacted, as Oedipus cuts out his own eyes, symbolically inscribing on his own body the cut, splitting himself in two, before and after, past and present, inscribing history on his body in order to confront the future, disfiguring himself as he dissociates himself from the horror of the past, defacing himself gouging out his eyes, mocking himself as monstrous as he signals the unnatural acts he has committed. Literalizing the blindness that plagued Oedipus and his city, Oedipus takes on his own punishment, recognizes himself as the guilty one, the sinner, effectively removes himself from the city of which he was once savior, putting himself outside its bounds in order to secure it. He acts. He speaks as a subject who takes responsibility for his desires, even though those desires were unknown to him in their true nature. But Sam is not yet allowed to be a subject, let alone take responsibility for his desires, be they his or someone else's, someone to whom he still perhaps belongs. The vessel that Sam's musical body is pours the romance into the white relationship between Rick and Elsa. His song, as time goes by, utters the truth that neither of them want to see, that the past is over and never was what it seemed to be. Their idyll is a myth. Ilsa was never free to be Rick's lover. She was always, unbeknownst to her, still married. According to convention, she was not allowed to be occupied elsewhere. She was owned by another man. The only way that she can be a diegetically sympathetic love interest for Rick is by not knowing that Victor Laszlo is still alive. Sam's minstrel existence allows Rick to be invested with the eroticism of blackness that attracts Elsa. Sam contaminates the whiteness that the collective unconscious of the studio-produced Casablanca works to achieve, and which the world of Hollywood serves to protect, even as he facilitates its desire and subjectivity. The part object that Sam's eviscerated, emasculated body becomes, as it lends its phallic status to Rick, producing the music that flows, and in flowing, stimulates the desire that cements Ilsa and Rick, while feminizing Sam, and invests Sam with a maternal, nurturing, compliant, I'll look after you, Massa role. As their muse, he eroticizes Rick and Ilsa's relationship while marginalizing his own desire, a desire that is only allowed to subsist so long as it is sublimated in the white heterosexual legitimated desire of the co-stars. Sam's desire is only allowed to exist as subordinated to, yet supportive of, the white narrative of heterosexual desire. The narrative hypocritically holds out the promise to Sam that his desire can also be legitimated, but only at the cost of mirroring the desire it helps to produce and sustain, or rather, to recapture and establish retrospectively as legitimate. Sam's song is the only thing that breathes life into the relationship that has founded on Ilsa's desertion of Rick and her rediscovery of her legitimate husband. The promise to Sam is that you too can become like us, but you can never be one of us, because we are what we are, partly because of you. While Rick absorbs the primitive, magical, bestial sexuality Sam has on offer, Sam is also replete with uncontrollable, insupportable myths of Negroes, as Fanon has shown. Sam's body communicates, channels, directs, lends itself as a vessel containing raw, unformulated desires to Rick, his master, who shapes those desires into something new or some new version of the same, white heterosexual desire. Sam's desires have no value in the system and as such are not desires. Their delegitimation occurs before they can be recognized, so that even their expression is only ever indirect. Sam can be the cupid, the gelling agent, the go-between, the feminized glue, the simple, uncomplicated innocent whose raw, untrained, natural, unformed musical talent is harnessed in the service of white desire, cultivated by white law, regulated by heterosexual paternal authority. And at this point, if I can, I'd just like to show a brief clip from the film. Thanks.
Never out of date, hearts full of passion, jealousy and hate. Woman needs man, and man must have his mate that no one can deny. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die. The world will always welcome lovers as time goes by.
Henri wants us to finish this bottle and then 3 more. Says he'll water his garden with champagne before he'll let the Germans drink it.
The reading that Gooding-Williams provides has the merit of bringing to light the way in which Sam is doubly marginalized and doubly exploited. He lends both his musicality and his sexuality to Rick. Building on the analysis of Gooding-Williams, but using abjection rather than fetishism as a framework for interpreting the issues of imperialism, racism, heterosexism, and sexism, I suggest that Rick's success as an attractive hero rests on his ability to exploit and sublimate the power of black sexuality and to tame the wild abandon of homoerotic undertones. At the same time, the ambiguity that Rick both embodies and represses makes him ultimately an unacceptable American hero. By sending Elsa, the white heroine, off to America with Laszlo, Rick secures his homeland from the nascent threat of miscegenation and contains any homosexual subtext that the film might endorse within the borders of Morocco. Thus, the film restores the authority of a white patriarchal heterosexual order by allowing the disruptive forces of Elsa's independence and Sam's emergent homosexuality to briefly appear, only to re-establish their marginality. Ilsa does not merely submit to Rick's will, she does so only after threatening Rick with a gun, a phallic embodiment of the threat of castration, and accusing him of cowardice. She thereby calls him to action, reminding him of his heroic and national duty, and at the same time reinforcing the boundaries of law and the heterosexist order. It is only after recalling Rick to his duty as an American that Ilsa retreats back into the predictable feminine role that, after all, defines her. That role is circumscribed not only by gender, not only by heteronormativity, but crucially, as I have tried to show, it is also shaped by whiteness. Laszlo must be the one to stay with Elsa so that America is protected from the possible contamination that would ensue from her potential union with Rick. Sam must be eliminated from the equation. Rick must be strong, dominant, courageous, the man, and Ilsa must collapse back into her feminine role under his protection. Thanks.